All right.
Good morning. Blessings to everybody as we gather together for a Bible study. Um, let's begin with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to have a couple of announcements. Gracious Heavenly Father, we ask that you would continue to be with us and bless us during this time. We pray that you are working to keep everybody safe during this time also, and that for those who have become ill, that you would heal them of their sicknesses if it is your will. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, a couple announcements, as I said. I know folks have been asking that we try a different format, but unfortunately our internet is not reliable enough to consider different formats for doing the Bible study or for live streaming our service at this moment in time. I'm trying to get things worked out with Windstream so that we can have a more consistent and reliable signal, but that might take some time, and it might not even be done before this whole thing is over. But in the meantime, we're going to muddle along as best as we possibly can, and we'll get through this. Also, I just want to ask that everybody please respect the assembly limitations that the county has put out. I don't know if you got the phone call, but I know we had the phone call here that they're saying if we don't stop messing around, they're going to put in place stricter measures. I don't know about you, but I prefer not to have the stricter measures. But so please be respecting of those various measures that have been put in place. With that said, let's get into our gospel reading, Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. This is a reading that I know there's going to be some teachers that are going to be saying, I know what Jesus is having to deal with, and there's going to be coaches that are going to be going, yeah, I know exactly what Jesus is dealing with. Well, we'll see. Let's begin here. Then the mother of the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons. And kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom. And Jesus answered, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink? He said. They said to him, we are able. He said to them, you will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers, but Jesus called them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for the many. So, I'm sure everybody's heard the term helicopter parent, maybe even the more recent term of the Black Hawk parents, the parents who are always pushing their kids forward and always hanging around trying to make sure that the coach puts them on the starting lineup, to make sure the teachers are giving them the A's and all of these kind of things. Well, that's not really a new phenomenon. That's been around for a while, and we see it in this reading. As James and John, their mom comes to Jesus and asks him to have her boys sit on the right and left hand side. Now, if you're not familiar with seating arrangements and the various forms of etiquette and whatnot, these are significant seats. We usually don't think in terms of this in the U.S. just because We tend to have a little bit more egalitarian view of folks. But when it comes to the seating arrangement, to be seated at the right hand or in the left hand of the primary person is to be seated in a position of great honor. Probably the closest that we might see in our modern context is at, say, the banquet following a wedding, where you have the wedding party. They all sit up at what would be considered the head table. You know, the table where everybody can see the bride and the groom and watch them as they eat. Or depending on the traditions of your area, clink their glasses so you can watch them kiss and things like that. But the people of outside of the bride and groom in the place of greatest honor are those in the wedding party. So the bride and groom would be sitting next to each other. And then on the outside from there, you'd have the best man and the maid of honor or matron of honor, depending on how things are, and so on and so forth. And then from the tables flowing out from there, you have that idea of greater importance to the bridal family or the groom's family by their position to the head table. But the long and short of it is James and John's mom is asking that Jesus sits them in the places of greatest honor. And at the same time, not only is this kind of an etiquette thing, but it is also a demonstration of what kind of authority do they have. You probably have heard the term right-hand man, and referring to the guy who does everything that is needed to be done for the person in charge of things. And this is where it pretty much comes from, is that idea that the person of the greatest authority underneath the person in charge sits on the in charge person's right hand. The next person would be the one who sits on his left. Don't ask me where they came up with right was higher than left. I couldn't actually tell you that, but that's what is being asked. And so when we have this incident between, should we call her Mrs. Zebedee? Because James and John's mom is just starting to get a little awkward. Mrs. Zebedee here, she probably have heard from her boys what Jesus said about sitting upon thrones. And so maybe she's got these visions of grandeur going. And she's going, all right, let's make sure that they get the best thrones, you know? And Jesus can have the absolute best, but they should get at least the next best. So that's where her thought process is going here. But when Jesus speaks of coming into his kingdom, he's got a different idea. So while she's thinking in terms of authority, of power, and the like, Jesus, while he is thinking in terms of his authority and his power, he is thinking of it in a different fashion. And some of our clue is going to be in this immediate context where we get to the ending part where he says, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now this hits on a classic misunderstanding of the use of authority within the church. We have a tendency, I think, particularly of late, to see the use of authority as more along the lines of, say, the modern equivalent of a CEO, or even in some cases a king, where this absolute authority, they rule over, what they say goes, and all that kind of thing. And here Jesus is, well, that's not exactly what's going on here. See, when Jesus talks about coming into his kingdom, he's not really referencing going and sitting on the heavenly throne. And this is especially clear in the Gospel of Matthew, and particularly with the reign of heaven parables, where he describes this very much servant view, where he is expressing his authority by serving others, in particular serving others through the giving of his life. Like I said, we have a clue to this in the immediate context, where Jesus says the Son of Man came to give his life for the many. So we really have a case here of Mrs. Zebedee didn't actually realize what she was asking Jesus. She's thinking in terms of importance. Jesus is thinking in terms of the cross. So when Jesus comes into his reign, it's not when he sits upon a throne, it's when he is hanging from the cross. Because he's doing his reigning thing from that cross. He's giving his life for the benefit of others, namely us, and fellow believers, and well, for everybody, to be honest, but those who will benefit from it are those in faith. But anyhow, so this is really going to be, she's talking ruling and Jesus is talking dying, which gives us kind of an idea, okay, what Jesus means, you don't know what you're asking. Because when she's asking for him James and John to sit on his right and left hand side, she's asking from Jesus' point of view that James and John get to hang on either side of Jesus. Let's remember the crucifixion scene, how things were set up. I'm sure most of us have seen the various depictions of the crucifixion, so you probably have a good idea of what I'm going to be talking about. And that the way it was set up, Jesus was on the cross that was in the middle of three crosses. So he's in the middle. That means he's got a guy in his right hand, he's got a guy in his left hand. Jesus comes into his reign on the cross. Those places are already taken. You have the thief on the right hand side, you have the thief on the left hand side. So Jesus is pointing out that really you just don't have a clue what you're talking about. And that makes a lot of sense in that, with his response, and the fact particularly that the disciples still didn't have a clue what Jesus was talking about when he was saying he was going to Jerusalem to die and that he would rise again in 3 days. They just really didn't get it. And it was one of those things that you hear it, you maybe even can say the words back, but it just doesn't seem to, like, that really clicking. And it's kind of like the information's going in one ear, out the other almost. But so Jesus isn't going to promise them a seat. He promises them a cup instead. You can share in the cup. Now, if we continue with the misunderstanding that Mrs. Zebedee, she's going to hear that and she's going, oh, that's just great. That's wonderful, because sharing the cup is a sign of unity. It's a sign of being together. It's a sign of acceptance. It's a sign of being united together as one body. There's a reason why it was a long-standing tradition in the history of our church bodies that when communion was served, that there was only the chalice. People were sharing from that one cup. It was a visible reminder of our unity with Christ. The individual cup is actually a very recent innovation, so to speak. I believe it came about right around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, maybe even later than that. I'm trying to remember. I recently read about it, but it's neither here nor there. But anyhow, so there's that idea of unity in the cup. But when Jesus is speaking of the cup, he's not sharing something pleasant. What is the cup that Jesus ends up drinking from? The cup of God's wrath. So does it sound like Jesus might be promising them something great and wonderful? Not really. He's referencing hardship. And in the Old Testament, they mention the cup of something like 14 times, and each of those 14 times is a reference to facing God's wrath. In other words, to drink from the cup is bad news. Jesus is basically saying, okay, you get to share in the hardships. And he did. James would be killed in a riot, I believe is what it was. I'm trying to remember now. Well, James was killed very early on in the history of the church. And then, of course, John, well, John would later die pretty much of natural causes, didn't exactly have the easiest of life, at least according to what we know from tradition. We do know for sure that he was exiled on the island of Patmos, thanks to the book of Revelation. We do have reason to believe that he went through several of the persecutions. Tradition, I think, has him, they tried to poison him, they tried to boil him in oil, and they tried to do something else to him, and he didn't die. How much truth there is to those, I don't know, but that is a part of the, what you would call the hagiography of John. But we do know for certain that he lived to be an old man and that he was exiled to the island of Patmos, which is definitely suggesting he didn't exactly have an easy life. And we would see that actually happen with the rest of his disciples. And each of them had various things happen to them throughout the courses of their ministry. You can get a glimpse of it in the book of Acts, particularly with the things that happened with Paul. And he had some interesting things happen to him. But anyhow, so all of this is stemming from a classic difference in understanding. I won't say a failure in communication, but definitely a failure in understanding because of different points of different assumptions is what people are meaning. Pardon me. So anyhow, the long and short of this is we start to see we see in this exchange exactly how Jesus expresses his reigning, his ruling, his acting as king, and that he comes to give his life as a ransom for the many. Getting into the particular term, ransom, lutron, that is typically used to describe the payment to release a person from slavery. Just as a quick reminder, slavery in those days was more along the lines of what we would say consider indentured servitude, and that you exchanged your freedom for financial support in the form of having somebody who made sure you were fed, clothed, and had a place to stay. And you would work for them in a bid to gain your freedom. And one of the things that you could do is you could save up your pennies, so to speak, and eventually buy your freedom and no longer be a slave. And the term for that is lutron. Which, now that I think about it, sounds an awful lot like Lutheran. I'm sure it's a complete coincidence. But anyhow, so Jesus is making that clear. And it really kind of just flipped things on its head. And typically when we think about kings acting, how many kings do we know of who would go out and fight them on their own and would give up their life for other folks? And how do kings and other rulers, we'll include modern day ruler terms, do the fighting themselves? And usually they send other people to go die for them, right? And which is how, they would kind of understand ruling, particularly the disciples. They didn't understand ruling as lording it over others, that they would command armies to be gathered and armies to be sent, and they would pass judgment on others, and but it wouldn't be so much their neck on the line, so to speak. It would be others. And Jesus is making the point, no, that's not how it's going to be. If you are going to be greatest, you must be slave to all. You should be servant. And so that's how he's going to approach ruling. That's how he's going to approach authority. And we do well, I think, to pay attention to that, not just in the aspect of the gospel understanding, which is the primary understanding, but also in our understanding of how we interact with one another. I mean, I've noticed all too often that when it comes down to questions of authority, it's almost along the lines of who gets to wear the crown.
And sometimes I feel like with parenting, that sometimes it's very tempting to use one's authority over one's children to make life better for yourself instead of making life better for one's children.
Yeah, the comment was made that it's kind of like in the realms of parenting, where parents would use their authority as parents to command their children, not so much for the children's good, but to make life better for the parent. I would say that probably would work as an idea. We commonly will see this in regards to the male-female relationship. We'll see this in regards to our relationships with others within the church, and things of that nature. When the reality is Jesus is saying that our authority is based in serving, not in lording it over. And when you look at it that way, it really does kind of change how we would look at a few things in regards to authority and the headship ideas that will come later in the epistles. And so it is kind of an it does kind of flip things on its head. Pardon me. My throat is dry. That's why I'm coughing.
I suppose that cycles we used to the idea that most rulers, like, were definitely, whatever good they did for the people, they weren't gonna not do good for themselves. Like, it's all one thing to do something good for the people, but we're not doing it with callous here.
Yeah, and the comment here was made that the disciples would be used to that, for whatever good the rulers were going to do for the people, the rulers were also going to do what was good for them. And so they might do some nice things for the people, but they're not going to give up their palace, so to speak. There's actually a lot of truth to that. I mean, we don't expect any of our leaders to give up the nice things in life. And that was one of the things that, you can notice in the very hierarchical structures. Now this has changed, I know, because the changes came about just before my dad was retiring. I mean, it used to be within the military, the higher rank you had, the more privileges you had, and the more nice things that were provided. So the enlisted, I can remember the airmen, they kind of had something of a club on base. They had a utilitarian pool that they might be able to swim in. I'm just remembering from the bases my dad was stationed at. And then the enlisted, they might have something that's a little bit nicer. The NCOs, I used to joke the NCO's pool was always better than the officers' pool. And as my dad would point out, that was because the sergeants were in charge of designing things. But the officers' club was always more palatial than the other clubs on the base. And they would have better housing for the officers. So you could figure out who the base commanders and the wing commander's house was, because they looked like small mansions on the base, as opposed to a lot of the duplexes and townhomes that some of the other folks would be living in. And the idea is that with the greater this was a recognition of their greater responsibility and the greater authority that they held. And so it was viewed as something that they earned and to be preserved and things of that nature. So it's something that's ingrained into our societal thinking. And so we expect those who are in those positions of power would likely be doing things that would preserve those bonuses. And Jesus is really flipping things on its head, expectations completely on their head. Because what does he do to rule? He says he leaves behind his throne. He leaves behind his the riches that he had. He doesn't make use of the power that he has. I mean, Jesus could easily very much command the angel armies to act in his defense and to rise up against the Jewish leadership and the Roman authorities and all of that, but instead he gives up his life. He acts as the servant. He acts, you could say, if we want to put it in some of our modern terms, he acts as the private. It's the privates who get put up on the front lines. Not so much the colonels, not so much the generals, and definitely not the president. But here he goes. He's going to go out, and he's going to be the one on the front line. He's the one who's going to do it. So we have this just total reversal of what we would expect. All right. Let's move on here. Matthew 20, 29 through 34. And as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him, and behold, there were two blind men sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent. They cried out all the more, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And stopping, Jesus called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." And Jesus in pity touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. All right. So it's another incident of healing, one that we can learn from. And one of the things we learn is from the interaction that we have with the people. Jesus is leaving. Blind men start yelling, "Lord, have mercy on us." So how does the crowd around Jesus react?
Leave them alone.
Yeah, leave him alone. Be quiet. Stop bothering Jesus. Stop and bothering the important man. And this is when you sit there and you go, boy, they just do not get things, do they?
What health is not helpful at all.
Yeah. Seriously, at least in the narrative that Matthew has here, Jesus just got finished telling them that the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. And they're telling people who are asking Jesus for help to shut up. Leave the important man alone. What does Jesus do? How may I serve you? Do you think when they said thank you, he said my pleasure? I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. But anyhow, so Jesus is in this, well, Matthew at least for us is highlighting the role that Jesus has come to play, and that is the servant. And he's serving these people who would be considered less than desirable. And blind folk, they were somebody to be pitied, and they were somebody that you might give a few alms to, give them a little help out and whatnot, but you weren't going to hold them in great respect. They weren't going to be in positions of power. They just weren't going to be considered important. And I think I'm reasonably confident in saying that Matthew put these together here to really highlight that misunderstanding that happened with Mrs. Zebedee and her sons and Jesus and what he was saying and how he has come to serve. And he highlights it by having them serve those who we would consider to be important. Which also brings me to the point, we don't get to choose who God shows mercy to. And I know that is something that they could struggle with. We covered this a couple of weeks ago, where people would struggle with the idea of people that they considered really bad to be that they had trouble with the really bad people as recipients of God's grace.
Especially, I suppose, if you can point this other person who deserved a lot more and didn't get it.
Yeah. And the comment was that especially if you can point to somebody who you see deserves it a lot more but didn't get it. But this is where we just need to sit back and remember We're not God, He is. He's the one calling the shots, not us. And also that our judgment on these things is not going to be a flawless judgment. But anyhow, this is where I would go if there's any questions. I might just go ahead and move on because there's just not a lot to say about that. But it's kind of hard to ask questions when we're just recording the Bible study. Of course, now I'm also feeling self-conscious because I keep coughing. I still say, this whole COVID-19 thing couldn't have happened at a worse time in the state of Texas. Everybody's coughing, hacking and sneezing and stuffy heads, and everything has just gone into bloom. And of course, I'm taking a medication that just for allergies that just dries me out. All right. Part of me wants to wait to do this next reading next week. Because it is a highly appropriate reading for next week. But let's have a taster for next week. Matthew 21, 1 through 11. Now, when they drew near to Jerusalem, they came to Bethphage, and to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them at once." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, "Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, a foal, a beast of burden." The disciples went and did as Jesus directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put them on their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." All right, and so if you were paying attention to our calendar and you're paying attention to this reading, you realize why I was saying it would probably be more appropriate for this to be next week, because this is Palm Sunday reading, and next Sunday is Palm Sunday. Which, by the way, if you're interested in having palms to wave around at home, since we're likely going to still be under restricted orders next week, we will be getting our palms in this week. I have placed the order for our palms for Palm Sunday before all the restrictions came down. And so I'd rather they didn't go to waste, so if folks want to pick them up, once we have them in, feel free to come by and pick them up. Soon. That's all I can say is they're coming soon. I got the shipping notice Saturday, maybe Friday. I have to go back and look at my email. So I would, maybe they'll be here by tomorrow, maybe Tuesday. But anyhow, so we got palms coming. And we're looking at Palm Sunday here. Jesus is entering into Jerusalem. And this is one of those passages that's always just fascinated me. And I wonder, did the disciples not say anything? Jesus tells them, okay, head into town, and when you see a couple of donkeys, go pick them up. And if somebody objects, say that the Lord has need of them. And I always amaze at this, because my first thought is my response was, well, how do you know there's going to be a couple of donkeys at this spot? How do you know they're going to be ready there and waiting for you? sitting retrospect, 2020 and hindsight and all that, it's, of course, he's God. He knows that they're going to be there. But it just always, it struck me that the disciples just don't say a word. They just go and get it.
Yes, there you go. Also, they did raise the objection. Are you sure they won't think we're stealing?
Yeah. We would rather not be arrested and thrown into jail and have hands cut off and things like that. Yeah. Nobody wants to be branded as a donkey thief. I wonder if being a donkey thief was as high a crime as a horse thief was in the West. I might have to look that one up. But anyhow, they're heading into Jerusalem. He's going to ride these donkeys. And I know that the dominant narrative, and it's not a bad narrative, so please don't hear me say that, is that Jesus is showing his humility by riding on a donkey. And yes, it is a humble means of coming in, and that's one of the points that Isaiah makes when he's says humble and riding on a donkey. Is the donkey? It's a working animal. It's what a not well-off farmer might ride. He might ride his donkey into town or something like that. It's definitely not the ride of a king. The king's going to be on the fine stallion, and the pure white horse or something like that, or barring that, fine racing gelding or something along those lines, like something fancy, maybe a war horse or something like that. But here he rides in on a donkey, which is a humble means of transportation. But the thing that I question is it as humble as we sometimes try to make it out to be? Or is this more along the lines of the humble brag? A not so humble humility. Because this is how Jerusalem was to know its king. So to ride in on the donkey as he's doing isn't completely a humble thing. He is proclaiming, I am the king. This scene builds off of the events that are recorded in 1 Kings, the opening chapters here, where when David commands that this is how Solomon is to be recognized as king. He will be the one coming in on the donkey. And so for Jesus to ride the donkey into Jerusalem is a proclamation that he is David's rightful heir, especially in light of the prophecy. Excuse me, not Isaiah, but Zechariah. Excuse me. I goofed there. That Zechariah's prophecy, where he says, "Behold, your king is coming to you, humble, mounted on a donkey, a colt, a foal of a beast of burden." And so this is one of those places where I would not be surprised that the Pharisees and the chief priests and the scribes recognized what was going on. We already get that idea that the people recognized it as they're crying out, "Hosanna to the Son of David," and the like, and they're throwing down the palm branches in their coats, the sign of recognition of who he is, and the king has returned, and all this great and wonderful stuff. Jesus is making it very clear of who he thinks he is.
Arrogant, confirmation of Jesus being David's rightful heir?
Herod should have. The question was, did Herod really care that Jesus was being proclaimed as David's rightful heir? And the answer is, he really should have, because his throne belonged to Jesus, basically. And so, yeah, he should have cared. But this fulfillment of prophecy in such a humble manner is actually a very straightforward statement of, I am the king. I am the one who rightfully sits on the throne of David. I am the one who rightfully rules in Jerusalem. So when he's entering in through the gates, when he comes in through the beautiful gate, he is very much proclaiming himself, I am that promised king. And this is going to fit with the overall narrative that we see in the Gospels, where Jesus stays out in the wilderness, and then he finally decides, then he comes to the point where, okay, it's time, the conflict must occur. And he goes into Jerusalem. And we'll see Jesus actually tweak people's noses. He is going to force the confrontation. Because if you recall, the chief priests, the scribes and all that, they were hoping to do it in secret. Jesus pushes their hand and says, okay, we're going to do it now. And on that note, we're going to wrap up as we're out of time. Again, I want to apologize that we are doing this recorded. Our internet has been spotty at best, and so we're a little leery of trying to live stream at the moment. Hopefully we get things wrapped up and fixed in due time, but in the meantime, please bear with us and have patience, and Lord's blessings. Let's close in prayer. Gracious Lord, we give thanks to you for this time together, and we ask that you would continue to be with us and bless us.